Hello and welcome to the Webin 7.6 release notes video review. So this release is all about the API functionality, API connectivity, and there's a really interesting piece of functionality here that we're going to take a look at. Now, most of the items in this release all relate to this API functionality. So we'll kind of look at all these together. And I think the best way to do this is just I'll run through a very quick demo on how to set it up and some possibilities that we can use this for. Okay, so it says a new external API credentials section has been created. This provides a secure, centralized way to store and reuse credentials across multiple integrations. Combining that with the new API request component, it enables fully managed authentication communication with external services. So I kind of think of this as a type of API client. So if you think of like an email client where you would create your email account, so you put in your email credentials, so what type of email you're connecting to, IMAP or POP, and then you put in the credentials, and then that creates the connection, and then you use the application to manage your emails and sort them and delete them, things like that. So this is kind of how I see this, is kind of setting up a bit of an API client where you initiate your authentication with your API keys or username, password, however that needs to be authenticated. And then you can use the API request component to then interact with the API going forward. So it just allows you to set up that authentication and then use the API in a secure environment. So as I said, there's a few components to this, and a lot of these items in this release relate to that. So let's just get stuck into it. So under settings, if we scroll down to this new external API credentials, and as it's mentioned in here too, this of course can be, the access to this can be controlled through the regular admin user roles. So some admins, you can give access to this, and some you can lock that out. So then we have this section here where we can create a new set of credentials. So I've already set up two demo ones that we'll look at, but basically you give it a descriptive name, an alias is created from that. So that's obviously what the system will use to reference this set of credentials. And then you set up the authentication type. So depending on the API you're working with, they'll have different authentication methods. So you need to look at their documentation and set up the best one for that. So depending on what you choose depends on what options you get. So a basic just gives you username and password, API key, you put in the key that you generate from the third-party service, and OAuth 2 has your client ID, client secret, and the token URL is like the URL that API uses to authenticate with. It'll supply a token and give that back to the client to authenticate with. So you need to know those details, again, from their documentation, what to put in here. But let's look at the ones I've already set up. So my first use case would be simply to connect to Webin1's own APIs, so but with a different site. So let's say we want to grab data from a completely different Webin1 site and pull that into this site here. So I'm just on a test site that I'm using the agency template, and over here there's another site, another demo site I've got with the Dine and Wine template. So what we can do, imagining this is a third-party service, which essentially it is they're two different sites. They're not connected to each other in the typical sense. So we can come in here to settings and come to the API applications, which has already been released. and we can set up sort of a new API project. This is where we're going to get our API keys for this particular site. So I set up one called cross-site test. So just give it a name, and the type would be server to server, and that's in most cases. And then that generates your client ID and client secrets. So we get that set up, and you would do the same if it was like a third-party system. You'd set up your API keys. Then we can come back to the site we're working on, and I'll just go into this one that I've already set up. But so you can see I've given it a name. The alias is generated, and in this case, Web1's APIs use the OAuth2 authentication type. And if you just look at the documentation quickly for Web1's APIs, so we'll go through all this, and it mentions here that it uses OAuth2, tells you how to generate the keys, and then it talks about the authentication token endpoint or token URL. So that's what it's asking for further down here. So obviously we can enter in the client ID and client secrets that we generated when we set up the API project. And looking through the documentation, we can find that, okay, this is the token URL, or token endpoint, that's going to get that authorization token for us. So you can see that at the end here, but of course, because these are two completely different sites, we're working with third-party systems, you would need the full URL so that it can actually access that. It's not a relative link. So I've just gone and got the trial site URL and constructed that URL in full. And I've added a scope down here. So again, looking at the documentation, it says here that the scope for this token endpoint is public API. So you can type that in and then click add, and it will add that on. So obviously some APIs may have multiple scopes, I assume, but that's the setup for this particular API use case. So we go ahead and save that, and now that's locked away as saved credentials that we can now call upon and have that connect to the API. Okay, so how do we actually use this? So it says down here, there's an example using the component, the new component that they've set up, the API request. So this is what you now configure to go and talk to the API and retrieve the information that you want. Now, it doesn't only retrieve information. As it says here, you can also use post, put, and patch methods. So that means you can actually communicate back to the API as well, using a Liquid component. And it all works with JSON data, so you can use and manipulate that data on your site with Liquid as well. So there's really cool implementation for this. And just like with most other components, you can assign layouts to them, so you can create templates to render the data out that you're getting back from that API. So effectively, it becomes like a component or a module. You would use it just like a component or a module on a typical Web1 site, but it could be pulling from different third-party source of data. Okay, so let's have a look at that. So I'm going to go to a test page. Okay, so this page has nothing on there. Now in our component manager, we now have the API request component in here. And this allows us to build out that request to the API. So first off, we want to define our method. So get is obviously where you're getting data, so you can work with that data and display it. Posting is when you're sending that data to the third-party service. So when you're saving information there. Put rather would be more of an update process. And I believe patches, as far as I'm aware, it's similar to put, like you're just updating something in part. Okay, and again, you would look at the documentation for the third-party service that you're connecting to. So if we're looking at a Web1 site, what we want to do is look for the API endpoint that we want to connect to see what the documentation tells us that we need in order to get information or post information. So in this case, I just want to pull down some module items. So let's look at the module items API. And so here, there's a few different methods that we can use here. The first one here is module items list. So that's what I want to do. I want to list out some module items. We can see that it's a get method. So that's what we've got selected. And it gives us the endpoint. So again, we could copy out that endpoint and put that URL in. But of course, this is a relative URL. So we need to put in the full trial site URL. So I'm just going to grab that from there. Okay, so we've got the full URL now, but of course there's also this sort of placeholder here for the module ID because we need to insert the actual ID for the module that we want to communicate with. So if we have a look in the other Web1 site, and I'm going to connect to the Teams, our Teams module. So just hovering over that, I can see the URL down the bottom says the ID is 1887. So we'll just replace that placeholder with 1887. And I'll just jump back to the documentation because we want to keep working through this to find out the information we need for this. So then we get to the authentication section, and this is where we choose the authentication credentials that we've already saved. So this is the whole point of saving those credentials. So you could have a whole bunch of different credentials saved for different services. And then in here, you just select which one you want to connect to. So in this case, we want to do the Web1 cross-site sample that I set up. And then we have a body. So the body is where we would send the JSON data to the API to tell it what we want back. So this is kind of like a filter or search parameters where we could set like the limit or have a where condition in here, how we want it to be ordered, and if we want to offset. So different API endpoints will have different bodies that you can send or different data that they accept. But in most cases, when you're doing a GET request, you can probably, for this demo, we can leave this blank because we just want to retrieve whatever the default is, so the first 10 items. So for now, I'm going to leave that blank. We can see we can add headers, so that's if you need to send specific headers along with the request. That's probably for a little bit more complicated setups or different requirements, whatever, depending on the API you're connecting to. And just like other components, we can put in a layout. So this would be a custom layout. So you would save a layout file in your file manager, and then you would put the path to that file in here. Then we have a collection variable. So this is for if we want to push the data that we're going to receive to a liquid collection that we can then just use directly on the page or underneath the component when we render that out. So that's what I'm going to do in this case because I don't have a layout set up. So I'm just going to call it data. And then it gives us the component code to copy. So just like constructing a component for any other module. So click on that to copy it, and then I'm going to paste that onto the page. Okay, so you can see it's got all the information that we put into that builder. And to actually see that data being output, we need to use the data keyword that I've added to the collection variable. So I'm going to put it just in a pre-element just so it formats a bit nicely. I'm just going to put data, and that'll spit out whatever it returns back to us. But I just like to add the strip HTML filter whenever I'm getting any JSON data like this, because if there's HTML formatting in there. Sometimes it can break the layout or look strange within the pre-elements. So I just always, as sort of a best practice, I put the strip HTML on just to keep it clean, that's all. So we'll save that and preview. So if all going well, it'll connect and give us at least some items from this Dine and Wine site that's a completely different site onto this digital agency site. So there's no error messages, so it looks like it's got a status code of 200, which looks good. And you can see here in the content item within this JSON response, we've got items, a whole bunch of stuff, and that goes on and on and on. So that looks like that's where our data is. So it looks like how Web1 are doing this, the response JSON that is returned is always within this API response sort of wrapper. So this is always consistent no matter what you're connecting to, whether it's a third-party service or another Web1 site. So this key here, or wrapper, seems to just, that's the default this object. So normally when you pull out some data from a component, you can do this.name to put render out the name. This is basically the top level key you would use. So you don't actually have to write API response dot, say, content. You can just do this.content. Kind of ignore that and just assume that that's the parent this object, if that makes sense. So for example, where we have data now, I can just go straight into the content. So dot content. And if I save that now, so what I'm trying to do is access this. Okay, so I want to output everything that's in here. So if I refresh now, we can see now we've got that. We've got items and then all that data that was in that content. So now this is starting to look a bit more like the data that we'd get out of a normal component from Web1. So we can start working with that. So for example, we've got a name here, Alex, and we can come down, we can see our next item starts. It has a name, Bob Smith. So just like anything else, we can start working with that. So if you're doing this on page, what you would do is you'd have to set up a for loop. Oops. So for, say, maybe item, you can give that any name you want in this dot content. And then we go into the items, so dot items. And just close off our for loop. And then so within here, we can, maybe we want to list out all the names, so we can just do item.name. So we're referencing the names. Save that. Actually, let's get rid of this one, so that's not in our way. And then when I preview, hopefully we just get a list of all the names from all those items. Okay, what have I done wrong? I just left off the S from items. Oh, and so that's not this, it's data, because we have to go into the data collection that we've created. Okay, save that and refresh. Okay, so we get our list of all the names. And then, of course, you can build out that layout to display whatever data you need to from that collection. So likewise, if you were creating a layout, if you wanted all of this to be in its own separate file, you can go and create that in a file in the file manager and then reference that file path in the component, and it would use that for the layout instead. Okay, so that's pretty cool. We can now grab information from another site and bring it in and display it on this side. But we can also push data into the other Dine and Wine site from this agency site. So again, with the API requests, rather than setting up a get method, we could do a post. And then again, you would refer to the documentation for creating a module item. So this is a post method, gives us the endpoint. Again, we'd copy that into there. Again, you would select your appropriate authentication. And in this case, you're going to want to put something in the body because we have to send information. We have to tell it what we want to create. So you can use the documentation to look at the structure of the data that you need to send. You could put all that into here. And now this is going to be used within the component string, which we can see down here is getting nice and complicated. And again, go through all the information. Now, in this case, this component you're using to send information to update another site or a third party, but it's also going to return information on this page, just like we returned information here with the GET response. When you send the information to the API, it's going to return with a response, which in the documentation they will describe what the response is going to look like as well. So that response that we get back can, again, still be handled on this page. So we can then go through that information and render that out as well. So usually that would be like a confirmation that, okay, you've created this item successfully, and this is the details of the item that were created. So you can output that on the source site as well. So that's why we still have the layout and the collection variable fields. Now, if we just have a little look at this, let's just replace that. Obviously, there's a lot of data serialized here all in one line, so it gets a bit complicated, but you could technically pull that out like into its own variable. So, or maybe I could create a capture and I could call it JSON data. Okay, and then you could construct that data in here. So let's pull that out. Okay, so I'm going to put all that into our capture up here, and down here for the body, I'll just reference that capture that we're creating. So JSON data, whoops. Okay, and then we can start structuring this a little nicer. So it still has escape characters here. I assume they're required. They may not be required if we don't use double quotes here. Like if you were to use single quotes, maybe that will work. I haven't tested, and we may be able to get rid of the escape characters. But I'll need to test that further. So you could start constructing the data here a little bit nicer, and you could use Liquid perhaps to create this information. So you might be doing something on this site that is generating the data that you then want to post to the third-party application, or you're pulling in data from other modules that constructs a lot of this information. So you could construct that with Liquid and then pass it into the API request component to send off to the third-party API. So it starts to become very flexible and very powerful on how you can use this. Okay, so let's quickly look at an actual third-party system. So in this case, I'm going to look at MailChimp. So they have their documentation on their API. And again, the documentation for APIs is going to vary. They're going to have different setups. They're going to have different terminology for things. And their API, the documentation is going to be structured differently as well for different technologies and code and things like that. So it does sort of take a little bit of massaging to sort of figure out what pieces of information you need. I was able to use Gemini to help me clarify what information from the MailChimp API was needed. And I was able to successfully set that up pretty easily. So AI is definitely a friend in this case if you're not too familiar with API setups. So again, we'll just jump back to the external API credentials where we're going to set up a new connection to another API. So in this case, MailChimp. As you can see, I've created one. And based on their documentation, the best connection method, they have a few different ones depending on what you want to do, but just for general listing out some information, it said that the basic authentication type was best with a username and password, but the password was the API key that you would normally generate in MailChimp. So we're still using an API key, but that's just being used as the password, and the username can just be anything, apparently. So anyway, that's the setup for this particular API connection. So we've now got that credential saved, and whoops, I can go back to my test page. So I'll just get rid of that component and we'll start setting up a new one. So API request component. Again, I want to just get information. The URL, again, it talks about finding the URL to access your MailChimp account. And you have to sort of figure out what data center your account's on. So just quickly put that in there. So mine's on the US4 data center. And obviously we're still going to need some more, like an endpoint to connect to on this URL, but I'll go back to that in a second. So the authentication, we choose the MailChimp that we've set up. Again, I think I can leave the body blank in this case, but so what we want to do now is go to the documentation for the particular endpoint that we want to connect to. So in this case, I just want to list out the campaigns that have been saved in that account. So we want the list campaigns, open that up, and it tells you all the different sort of data points that you can filter or search by. So again, I'm just going to leave that blank. It doesn't appear that anything's required, so I don't have to send anything particular. So I'm just going to put data again in the collection variable because I already have my little loop here. So hopefully that works okay. And we copy that component, paste that in. Oh, sorry, I didn't get the endpoint. So it's just / campaigns. So copy that. And rather than going back into my component manager, because it's just building out this component for me, I can just come in here and fix that up if I want to change any details there. So I'm just going to add the campaigns endpoint to our MailChimp URL. And let's see if that works. So refresh this page. Okay, it hasn't. So what I'm going to do is just go back to my pre-tag displaying all the data because I want to see what it's outputting, because I want to see if there's any error messages or anything like that. So that will help me troubleshoot what's actually happening. So save that. Refresh. Okay. So there is no error messages. The success was true. It's just that my loop obviously was going into the content, but I was looking for items with names. And in this case, it's called campaigns, so they're not items. So that's why it's always helpful just to output the raw data to see how we need to access the data with the relevant keys here. So we should just be able to change items here to campaigns. Now, I don't know if there's a name, if that's what they call it. It could be something else. We can have a quick look. It's a bit hard to look at it in this format, so we could list that out a bit nicer, but I'm just trying to do a shortcut here. Looks like title might be what they use instead of name. So let's use title here. So we're still referencing item because that's just what we've called the variable. And let's see if that outputs all the names of all the campaigns. Refresh. Okay, so we're still doing something wrong. So again, let's have a closer look at the content here. So instead of just outputting everything, we'll drill down into the content just to give us a better look at how that's being formatted. So now we're just looking at campaigns. So where was that title? Okay, so title is set within settings. So it's another level down. That's why I couldn't access it directly from the top of these items. So we need to go to settings first and then title. So see how just outputting that content helps us understand how it's structured, so then we know how to access the information. So we should be able to go item.settings.title. Just remove that for now till it's out of our way. Refresh. Okay, and there we have all our Treehouse campaigns directly from our MailChimp account. So it's a third-party service being rendered out onto this site. And again, we could actually post campaigns. We could create campaigns directly into our MailChimp account from the site. So yeah, it starts to become very powerful, the things you can do with this. And of course, whatever third-party service has an API, you can look at the documentation, piece together the information in both the credentials, where you set the credentials, and in the component builder for how you build out that request to the API. So it becomes a bit of an API client for you to use and easily set up API connections between your site and third-party services. Okay, so what else can we control with this? We have API application scopes. So this is back with the already implemented API applications. So here where we set up like an application to generate the key so that something else can access. What we can also do is set up scopes now. So a scope is basically just an area of data or sections of the system that you allow this API project to access. Because often when we're setting up a specific API application, we just want it for a particular purpose. Like in my example, I only wanted to access the Teams custom module. That's all I needed it for. That's all I wanted to access. So for security and simplicity, we can lock that down. So we would figure out what API it's using. In this case, I was using the admin v2. And we could, turn off everything that we don't want it to access and just leave on the things that we do want it to access. Just to really secure that application down and stop any unwanted access to anything else. Okay, so we would set up the scopes for the application that we're creating. So that's a additional functionality that we now have to the API applications. Okay, and yeah, it just says that if permissions are missing, if you're trying to access something that you don't have permissions for, there'll be an error. And yeah, so this update improves the API access control, making it clearer and easier to manage granular permissions across admin and front-end integrations. Okay, and then there are sort of two items here relating to if you're creating an API connection that's server to server, so websites and web services talking to each other, or if you're connecting with an iOS mobile application or an iOS applications connecting to your site. So we have now specific settings to do that because I believe it requires some extra data to pass along with that connection. So I know in the API applications, you can, so for example, set up the type. So if you were to choose iOS, it gives you the extra bundle ID and team ID that's obviously required for iOS API connections like that. But also if you're using webhooks to pass that information along to iOS mobile app. I believe you can do that as well. I think that's what this is referring to. So adding support for like a particular authentication method for signing outgoing webhooks, so that the system knows that the webhook's coming from the right source, and that it's not a bogus or a spam webhook or something like that. So you're kind of giving it a special key or secret to authenticate that it's from a true source. So I believe there's no particular field for this. I think you would just append like the parameter, this SK parameter with whatever your secret particular key is, and you would just enter that into the external URL. So you'd have your external URL for the webhook, and then you would append that URL parameter on that would pass along the secret. So hopefully all that made sense. That's getting a bit more involved and a bit more out of my knowledge of APIs. So if that's something you're working on, have a bit of a read over this, and we'll get more information into the documentation. But yeah, hopefully this is a great feature for you to start getting into APIs and connecting third-party services. Yeah, I can definitely see it's going to open a lot of doors, a lot of possibilities for working with Web1 sites. So really exciting to explore that further. Okay, and really just lastly, there was one other item here for the special characters in file names. So they're just improving the way that special characters are handled with file naming. So let's say you have an image that has some crazy characters in there, or maybe like special symbols or emojis. In this case, we've got multiple spaces. So things like that can potentially break linking to assets like images and files. So the system's going to automatically URL encode those. So something like this, which that wouldn't be supported in a URL, they're going to automatically encode it so that it's URL friendly. So essentially, when you upload this file, the system will detect there's a special character, and it basically gives it like an alias file name. So there'll be another file name or file path that can reference that image, and that will be the alias that it uses. Whenever you like select an image to use in like a custom module in a media field, or places like that through the admin, when you choose that image, it will actually render out the URL encoded alias to that file. So the file name itself will remain as it was in the file manager. You'll still see that, but if it needs to be accessed through the URL, then it can be correctly accessed with the alias, with the URL encoded, so that they won't break. So I think most of the time this will happen behind the scenes. Like if you're uploading, it will automatically create that alias, and when you're using that within the components within the admin, it will know to generate that. But if you're sort of more manually coding pages and you're physically copying this file name, and putting that in it, that may not work. You may have to use the encoded version. But I think that would have broken anyway in the current setup. I haven't had any files with special characters like that, but probably just something to be a little bit more aware of now. I mean, it is always best practice to not have special characters, just something to keep in mind and be aware of that. And then there's a handful of bug fixes here, which I'll let you read through and see if those relate to any of your projects. Okay, thank you very much.